so we're going to identify those trees. And there happens to be, we're close to one here, so we get a closer look. There's one behind us here. By the way, do you know, speaking of form, how does this one differ from, let's say, the tallest one? How would you describe the differences this one and one of the tall ones across the road? Branches are lower. So there are branches lower to the ground, whereas the tallest ones seem to have no branches for about 30 or 40 feet. Anything else? What about I mentioned the word tall. This one is shorter. It's not only shorter, there's another way in which the form, it's also, it's wider,
It's
much
also
wider.
thicker. The branches are thicker.
Okay. So the main difference in the form is that one's tall and, shall we say, narrower, and this one is shorter and wider. So what happens is, this just points out when trees are in a forest, that's not really a forest, it's kind of like a stand of trees, but when there are other trees around, the lower branches don't get much sunlight, so they fall off. Most trees are self-pruning in a sense when the lower branches are not getting enough sun, they fall off. And it'll keep pushing up. It'll get taller because it needs sun. Well, that is, the sun-loving trees. There are another whole classification of trees that are understory trees that don't need sun. But this tree needs sun. So why is this one shorter and wider then? Pardon? It has room. When it was young, there were no trees around it. So it didn't have to grow tall. It didn't have to drop its lower branches. So this is where the question of size and form is helpful. However, under different conditions, you can get a little misled by it if you're not aware that different conditions, and that's one of the main conditions when you're walking in a forest. Trees will generally be tall and not have many branches, whereas in an open area they're more like this. So it can throw you off a little bit unless you're aware of that. That's why I wanted to make that point. Okay, now that we've talked about shape and form, what other clues are there about what kind of tree this is? The first thing we talked about was the difference between two kinds of trees, the naked ones and the non-naked ones. How does this one get classified?
Non-naked?
That's a whole different category we haven't talked too much about, but we'll get to that later. Yes, conifer. So it's not deciduous. It doesn't lose its leaves. It's a conifer. That's the first one. Now, there are lots of different conifers. So how are we going to narrow it down further? We already mentioned one characteristic that we looked at as we were walking by. We were admiring the beauty of its bark, its stem.
The needles would be
And the needles would be another one. Let's stick with the bark for a second. So the bark, how would you describe that? You can look at this one here, you can look at that one. It's a little bit more, just forget that one for now, this one here. Or looking across the road. How would you describe that? Because it's hard to, you got to come up with the words to be able to remember.
Yep.
Okay, mottled.
Yep.
So, in other words, it's not all the same color. It's got almost stripy. It's mottled or stripy. Would you say that it has deep furrows and ridges in it?
Blade-like? It's
Deep?
flat? It looks to me more like flat. Like
Okay, so we introduced the notion of ridges and furrows, but now you're saying it doesn't really apply here. Instead, you said platy.
Like flatter?
Flatter, and plates are the idea of flatter. So it's still broken up, but it's more platy. It doesn't have big ridges and furrows. Okay, so you're starting to notice some of these subtle differences. All right, so bark is the second clue. Another thing we talked about was, well, you mentioned needles. Okay, So it's coniferous, so it has the needles. It has its leaves still on it. Now, there are lots of different kinds of needles. How would you describe these needles? Feel free to walk up and check it more closely.
They're longer.
Quite long. Longer than what?
Longer than hemlock.
Okay. So the idea I'm trying to get at here is one, to go have a look at these needles
Yeah.
and tell me some words to describe them. Just give yourself like half a minute. I'll be right back.